when I was about 17, I stayed behind after school with a few mates to use the Sixth Form's LAN network to get a big Counter-Strike game going. This was back before I had a decent enough internet connection or a decent enough computer to actually play online games at home, so you can imagine I had an absolute ball. I mean, we all did, and we stayed so late that the caretakers had to physically start switching all the computers off all the mains in order to get us to leave. Since it was like November, it was actually dark by the time we were all on our way home, and the only light I had to guide my way was the glow from the orange street lamps at the side of the road. But all of a sudden, as I'm walking down the old half-mile-long street I used to live on, all the lights in the street just go out at once. It was so alarming that it literally stopped me in my tracks, and I found myself looking around to notice that all the lights in the nearby houses were off too. The power grid in the city I live in is pretty reliable, and that was the first time anything like that had happened, so naturally I'm a bit freaked out. I try calling a friend of mine to see if the power is out in their neighborhood too, but my phone won't work. I just keep getting this robot voice saying, "Your call could not be connected. Please hang up and try again." So, the phones are out, the lights are out, my parents aren't home yet, and I've got a voice in the back of my head that says World War III is about to start. I am way too anxious just to sit at home in the dark, both literally and figuratively, so I go out into the street and start walking over to where my friend lived, same one I tried to call. Other people have come out of the houses too, neighbors talking to one another, wondering what's going on. It was actually really freaky how dark it was outside. Like it's a thing that very few of us in the West ever get to see, an urban landscape completely plunged into darkness. There was a tension in the air, you could feel it. And without a working phone to get in touch with anyone or find out what was going on, that tension just got heavier and heavier. Literally nowhere had power. I walked like 30 minutes over to my mate's house with the only flickers of light being from hand torches and candles. You could see better around main roads thanks to car headlights, but it was chaos without traffic lights, and whole intersections were jammed up with cars trying to maneuver around each other. I made it to my mate's house, and obviously there was no power there either. Only at a time when it was much safer to do so. We didn't stay inside, and I've always thought it was weird how we gravitated back to the only real source of light. Pretty much everyone else did too, and in the course of walking up and down the car-clogged main roads, we just sort of bumped into the rest of our little friend group. And what started as quite an unnerving experience morphed into something supremely exciting. We had no idea when the power was coming back on, or why it had even gone out in the first place. And after a few hours of almost complete darkness, even the grown-ups around us started to openly wonder if it would come back anytime soon. Things started to take on a distinctly apocalyptic vibe. But we were teenage boys and we were together. We had that youthful air of invincibility that made us think that we could take on anything. It was actually quite euphoric, but that feeling wasn't to last. You see, we weren't the only people to detect a hint of tension in the air, and where other people saw potential chaos and danger, others saw opportunity. The first hint of it came when we saw 3 lads bolting out of a corner shop, quickly followed by the pursuing owner who barked at them that he'd called the police. Obviously, they'd taken advantage of the darkness to steal from him, and that was the first time it really registered with us just how vulnerable we all were at such a time. No power meant no light, but it also meant no alarm systems, no CCTV cameras, with the police being unable to respond to calls because of the terrible traffic. We started to see things like shop owners with baseball bats and iron bars in their hands, pulling down shutters over their windows, or drivers who'd have to be physically separated from one another to keep them from fighting. It was a bad scene, and it was foolish of us to stick around on the off chance that anything got particularly heated. To me, my mates decided to retreat to this primary school car park we used to skate on, one that was tucked away near the river and surrounded by trees. Maybe if it wasn't for the power cut, we'd have understood why that might be a bad idea, but whether it was the pitch darkness or just this general lack of awareness, we had no idea what was coming. And dear God, do I wish we had. So we were hanging around the car park, which was normally lit by a few lampposts dotted around, but obviously on that night it's near pitch darkness. The only light was coming from the moon or from our phone screens, which in like 2005 were not particularly bright. Literally anything could have snuck up on us if it was quiet enough. We had absolutely zero spatial awareness, which is what made the events that followed all the more terrifying. At first, one of us is all like, "Shh, did you hear that?" Everyone freezes, listening out for whatever our mate had heard, but there's just silence. A little while later, this happens again, and that time our apparently paranoid friend was insistent that he heard something in the trees nearby. But we just dismiss his fears as nothing but an attempt at a prank. So when one of us was grabbed by someone looking to put them in a chokehold, we all just thought it was another one of our number messing around. And I'll never forget the fear in the air when we suddenly realized that we were not alone anymore. That whoever had done the grabbing was a total stranger who must have just materialized from basically nowhere. One of us tried to wrestle the stranger off of our friend, but they seemed to be thrown to the ground by some unseen force. It was hideously confusing. Where these people were coming from and why they were doing it was a complete mystery. But I knew one thing for definite. We were under attack. I'm not even entirely sure what happened after that. I'm pretty sure we were outnumbered because I can remember at least 2 people kicking me after I was floored by a punch to the face. It seemed to last for ages too, and it only stopped when I heard 2 voices near me saying something like, "Oh, I think he's dead." "What? He's not moving. I think he died. God, let's get out of here, man." And then the kicking stops. I hear hurried footfalls, and then suddenly everything is quiet. I should have maybe felt some degree of relief that the attack had stopped, but that guy's words just rattled around my skull. He died. I look up from tucking my head into my chest and shielding it with my arms and see a few dark shapes either crawling or limping towards another dark shape that was lying motionless on the concrete. That was one of the worst moments of my life, thinking I was looking at the dead body of one of my closest friends. But thankfully, he wasn't dead. He wasn't exactly okay, but he wasn't dead. He must have taken a pretty heavy hit because he was completely knocked out cold. Like one of those bad knockouts too, when the person is groggy when they wake up. It was still really worrying, but Jesus, the pure relief I felt when he moved and groaned for the first time. None of us were hurt too bad, just a few black eyes and some busted lips. And despite the fact that we were concerned that the guy who got knocked out might have had a concussion, he didn't complain of feeling nauseous or dizzy over the next couple of days. In the end, we all just limped home, hoping the power would stay off so we wouldn't have to go to school the next day sporting black eyes and lip scabs. But the power did come back on, so we didn't even get the day off. My big takeaway from the night of the blackout wasn't so much how much it sucked being ambushed like that. It was something entirely more frightening. I had seen with my own eyes the brittle threads that hold society together don't need much pressure before they're stretching to breaking point. And all it takes is a little power outage before we're all feeling that pressure. But some of us feel something else too, and for some, the darkness brings out a primal, predatory desire to hunt and victimize the same people we call neighbors. And it's those kinds of people, the monsters in human meat suits, that we fell victim to that night. I live in a place called Beddington here in Maine. It's the least populated part of the state, which probably makes it one of the least populated areas in the country. And with a population of just over 50 people, we're the very definition of a one-stop light kind of town. We all live pretty spaced out too. Nearest neighbor on my right side is about a mile away. Nearest neighbor on my left side is more like 3 miles away. The sense of community here is really strong, but out here you really are alone, in most senses of the word. And that kind of isolation is made all the more obvious whenever there's a power cut. It's only happened like twice for the entire time I've been living out here, and one time it was only for about an hour. The second time, it must have been a serious fault down at whatever power station feeds us juice because the power was out all night. And I don't just remember that night because I couldn't watch the Pats play ball. it's burned in my memory for other reasons too. So like I said, second ever power cut, but thanks to the experience I gained from the first time around, I fare a little better that time. I have candles stored away. I have dynamo flashlights. I even got a battery-powered hot plate that would be good for a few uses, even if it did burn through the batteries. So instead of panicking and bumping into stuff in the dark, that time I just make myself comfortable, pick up a good book, and sit down to ride it out on the couch. Now it's at this point that I should bring up my dog, Teddy. Teddy got his name because my grown-up daughter thought he looks like a teddy bear, which he kinda does. And given his considerably superior senses, the power cuts never seemed to bother Teddy none. Teddy never bumped into furniture or got spooked at every little noise or shadow. Teddy just stayed curled up by the log fire and warmed his bones. As I curl myself up, Ted gives me this look at one point as if to say, "See, now you get it, old man. Just relax and take a load off. Power will come back when it's good and ready to." But Teddy didn't stay so relaxed for long, and neither did I. A couple of hours go by, and I'm so engrossed by the book I was reading that when Teddy started to bark, it almost scared me out of my wits. You see, Teddy never barked at anything, even when he saw squirrels or raccoons. He just sort of looked at me like, "What are you going to do about them? They're critters, old man." Nothing fazed him ever, so to even hear him yapping like that in the first place was pretty unusual. Then that got me wondering what could possibly freak him out enough to make him bark. I'm all like, "What is it, boy? What are you smelling?" But Ted just gets up, walks over towards the door to the hallway, and starts growling all low in between barks. And as I'm sitting there watching him, I get this real bad feeling in the pit of my stomach. This is the first time I'd ever seen him acting like that, downright aggressive and territorial. Now, as much as I respect the Second Amendment, I don't really believe in keeping a gun in the house. I hate the things, always have. And long story short, I lost a relative in a shooting accident when I was a kid. Now, just being around a pistol makes me kind of sweat and anxious. But what I do have on hand for some defense is an old recurve bow I used for hunting. Not exactly ideal to stop a burglar, but it was better than nothing. I must have looked like an old, worn-out Comanche warrior creeping through my living room with a freaking bow and arrow with only firelight to see what was going on. But I sure didn't feel like one. I just turned 55. I was a grown man. But something about all that darkness and being so isolated made me feel like a scared kid. Best case scenario, Teddy had picked up the smell of a bear or a lynx on the wild. One that was still way off in the distance. Worst case could be something considerably worse. When I take a peek out from the house through the window of my office, Teddy follows, jumping on the windowsill and barking a few times after sniffing the air. Whatever he was smelling, I sure wasn't seeing it. So after peering into the darkness for a minute or so, I just take Ted back into the TV room where he stopped his barking. All was quiet again, so I carried on with my reading. About an hour later, the same thing happens all over again. Teddy jumps up from the rug, barking up a storm, only this time he seems considerably more aggressive. He bounds over to the door of the TV room, scratching at the handle and growling in a way that actually kind of frightened me. Like I said, I've never seen Teddy act like that, like he was a completely different dog. When I let him out of the TV room, Teddy ran through the open door of the kitchen and started barking and scratching at the back door. I mean, he was going back there, and there was no way I was about to let him go outside. The mood he was in, he'd probably run off as fast as he could and get up getting himself lost. And besides that, I felt strangely safer with Ted around. He stopped barking for a second, sniffed the air, and then bolted back into the TV room, where he started barking even louder at the glass patio doors that led to the backyard. I follow him all like, "Get him, boy, tear him up." But when I catch a glimpse of the sliding glass doors, I'd swear I saw something moving in the shadows outside. I couldn't even tell you what I saw. It was nothing more than a flash of movement, but it was obvious enough for me to grab that recurve bow that I propped up against the couch. I was so scared that I could barely line the arrow up with the drawstring. Ted was going crazy at this point, acting like he was fixing to smash through the glass windows and chase down whatever he could smell. And like I said, It might even have been just the way the firelight reflected on the glass, but I wasn't willing to roll the dice on something being out there. Then suddenly, Ted stops barking again. I figured it's because he's lost the scent or something, because he shut up entirely and stops pawing at the glass in the back doors. But then he went and did the weirdest thing. He backs off from the doors, stands in front of me, shaking on all fours, and takes a pee right there on the carpet. He hadn't done anything like that since he was a puppy. Ted was hardcore house-trained. It definitely wasn't out of fear of some black bear either. Ted's been in the same area as those ever since he was a pup, and unless he actually saw one, I can't imagine that he'd freak out the way he did. But the fact remains that animals like dogs have been known to just go to the bathroom on themselves whenever a much larger predator is in the area. Only I can't imagine how much larger it'd have been to make Ted forget his house training. After that, he almost was completely silent, just the occasional whimper while I stood there with the flashlight, just waiting for the mother of all black bears to come smashing through my back windows. At least I hoped it was nothing but a black bear. I understand those animals, but I didn't understand what was going on during that power out at all, and it just about scared the life out of me. But by far the worst part of the experience was when I actually heard something on the little side walkway to my house. See, there's a little gravel path where my wife used to grow vegetables, right around the side of my house, and I swear to the Almighty that I heard two distinct crunches on the gravel, right as I'm staring out into the darkness for like the 100th time. That's when I started to call out, "I know you're there, and I'm armed. Now you better get out of here." I listened again, and for the next few minutes there was nothing but silence. And then just when I started to think that I'd just imagined the whole thing, I heard it again, clear as day. Footsteps on the gravel. That time I was closer, and I'd heard people walk up and down that gravel path 100 times over the years, so I'm telling you right now, whatever was outside my house that night was way, way bigger than a person. If it was a black bear, it must have been the biggest one on the entire East Coast. Now, I'm not saying it wasn't a bear or something. Maybe it was just a big old dog that got lost and took to wandering into my yard. But like I said, it was big. Really big. And you can bet your bottom that I came shaking like a crapping dog as I heard its footsteps getting quieter and quieter as it made its way off my property. I didn't hear nothing for the rest of the night. Ted didn't bark again, but it seemed like he'd thrown in the towel with that line of defense anyway. But I didn't hear nothing outside, and evidently nothing broke into the house, otherwise I'd be rambling on about it. It's just kind of surreal to me that one of the scariest experiences in my life comes across like a second-rate campfire tale. I don't scare easy, and what happened during that blackout scared the living hell out of me. I just hope whatever that thing was, whether it was a bear or the Turner beast or something else entirely, stays well away from my property in the future, because it'd take far more than just a few arrows to take down a beast as big as that. My Uncle Andrew has this story from back when he was a commercial airline pilot. He wasn't piloting the plane this happened to, but he heard the story from a friend of his who used to fly private jets around West Africa. Apparently the gig paid well enough, but because the safety regulations and some of the more turbulent politics around the region, the flying could get pretty hairy from time to time. A bunch of crazy stuff happened to him while he was over there, but the thing that made him quit makes for quite the yarn. So apparently his friend is co-piloting the private jet of some African ambassador, but the plane is basically falling apart. All the dials are faulty, the landing gear was on the fritz. Basically, you were taking your life in your hands whenever you piloted this aircraft. But since they were coming to the end of their contract, they didn't want to quit early and not get paid their bonus, so they worked with the ground crews to ensure the aircraft was just about fit for takeoff each time. Point being, my uncle's friend is seriously stressed out, and the actual pilot has taken to drinking most nights just to keep his nerves together. But the straw that broke the camel's back was this one night flight into Nigeria. The turbulence has been rough on this occasion, and apparently the pilots are just about ready to throw in the towel. But the flight is almost over, and they're both about to breathe a sigh of relief as they begin their descent into whatever airport they're flying into. The way my uncle tells it, his friend is focusing on the runway, but the entire city is behind it, this massive metropolis of glittering lights. And suddenly, all the lights just disappear, like the city itself was just swallowed up by the earth. My uncle's friend and the pilot of the private jet just about soiled their pants. With their faulty equipment and complete lack of experience landing in that particular city, they're maybe only seconds away from smashing that plane into the runway, or maybe even a building if they tried to pull away too late. Then to make matters worse, the pilot just seemed to shut down. He has this full-on mental breakdown and just freezes up in his seat. My uncle's buddy had to take control of the aircraft and basically just guess where all the runway and the buildings were. He said it was the most stressful and terrifying flight of his life, how he was expecting the plane to just burst into flames at any second as it collided with something. He pushed the engine to its absolute limits too, said the plane was shaking at the angle he was turning it at. Miraculously, they don't crash or stall, and they make it back into the skies above the darkened city. And my uncle's buddy starts bawling out the window for freezing up like he did. But the guy was catatonic until they landed and didn't say a thing in response. After that, they went into a holding pattern until the power came back on and they could get in touch with air traffic control and get permission to land. I hate flying as it is, but imagining that kind of scenario is like a pucker factor of 10. Word was the pilot was so freaked out that he refused to take the return flight, bought a business class ticket back to the US, and was never seen again. My uncle's friend had to wait until his client could hire a new pilot before he could get out of Lagos or Nairobi, or wherever it was. Somehow, he managed to finish his contract without that plane falling apart on him, or any more cities going dark, and he made it out of Africa with a buttload of bonus cash. But after that, he was much more selective of who his clients were, and I think now he just flies domestic and makes a steady salary that way. Crazy story though, right? Of all the times you don't want to get a power cut, landing a plane is definitely up there. Just over a year ago in October 2019, some real scary stuff went down and I thought I was going to lose my life. I live with my mom in California just out of Sacramento, and I love her a whole lot because she works really hard to take care of me. I'm much better right now, but a year ago I really wasn't doing so good, and I was dependent on an oxygen mask for my breathing. It wasn't like a face mask or anything, it was pretty discreet. I wore what's called a nasal cannula, which is like the little clear plastic tube that runs up your nose. It was quite uncomfortable at first, but you get used to anything after a while. Anyway, so I spend most of my time hooked up to a PPAP machine, and it was super important that it stayed switched on at all times or I might suffocate. But if it ever did switch off or break for any reason, I could just switch over to my battery-powered oxygen tank and voila, tragic death avoided. The system was flawlessly safe, or so I was led to believe, because what that system doesn't take into account is that, all of a sudden, PG&E might decide that it's going to switch the power off to my house. I wake up in the middle of the night feeling like I'm about to have a full-on anxiety attack, and it only takes me about a second before I realize that I can't breathe. I brought a hand to my face and felt that my nasal cannula was still in my nostrils, but when I rolled over in bed, I saw my PPAP machine was dark. Now, under any other circumstances, I could just unplug from the machine, walk into the spare bedroom, and plug into the battery-powered oxygen tank. But since I was so tired and whatever had happened to cut the power had happened when I was asleep, I'd lost vulnerable time to make the transition. So picture the scene. I feel like I'm about to pass out. I can't see a thing because it's dark, and I have to make it all the way across the hall and into the spare room when I feel like I can't make it 3 steps in front of me. It was the most scared I'd ever been in my life. I had a matter of seconds to get to the battery tank, I'm making all these wheezing sounds, and I can just feel myself getting weaker and weaker as I made it out of my bedroom and took my first steps into the hallway. I only make it a few paces before I just feel my knees buckling underneath me. I try to crawl, but I just can't. And that's about all I remember until the next thing I know, I'm sucking air through the cannula like a crazy person, coughing and sputtering with my mom's voice in my ear. I must have made a whole bunch of noise on the way out of my bedroom, and thank God, too, because it woke my mom up. She must have found me lying there, figured out what the deal was, then just dragged me far enough toward the spare bedroom that she could plug in my oxygen tube. I just remember lying there, taking these huge, deep breaths until I felt sort of okay again, but that only lasted a moment or two, until the memory of that fear came rushing back to me and I just burst into tears. We had to drive to the hospital to get me looked over by a doctor. You can get some nasty health complications if you're deprived of oxygen like that, and it's not just the obvious stuff either. Like it can cause blood clots in your arteries from the strain, and those can be pretty fatal. But yeah, I got checked over, and although I was pretty shaken up, I was otherwise okay. But then the whole thing comes out about the blackouts, and that caused a lot of controversy. For those that don't know, here in California it was discovered that some equipment owned by a bunch of electrical companies was causing forest fires. There was this huge fire where almost 100 people died, and the fire department found it was started by a power line that had fallen over. Then companies then catch a ton of crap from the federal government, and as a result, they basically made the decision to just cut power off to a bunch of people's homes during wildfire season. Unfortunately for us, our home was one of them. We got lucky though. Like one guy actually died because he was on home life support or something. The power went off and boom, massive organ failure. The power cuts affected other stuff too, like nebulizers, dialysis machines, refrigerators that kept insulin fresh. Power companies said they'd been warning people for months about it and they should make preparations, but I don't remember hearing anything about it. But yeah, scariest moment of my life right there, straight up thinking that I was gonna die. But like so many times before in my life, my mom was there to stop me from slipping away. In the year 1941, the world burned with conflict. World War II was approaching its height, and for the first time in human history, the combatants rained death on the civilian populations of their enemies from the air. Air wings, sometimes consisting of over 1,000 warplanes, dropped hundreds of thousands of pounds of high explosives overnight, reducing cities to rubble and killing thousands of unarmed civilians. It was a new kind of war, total war, where even innocents were fair game. Nazi Germany traded air raids with the beleaguered United Kingdom, and at some point, the bombing was so intense that it seemed only a matter of time before it might force a British surrender. Drastic measures had to be taken to reduce the effectiveness of German nighttime bombings. The top minds of the British Air Ministry convened to discuss the problem, and their solution was as effective as it was simple: a blackout. It was widely agreed upon that the Luftwaffe bombing capabilities would be much less effective if all man-made lighting on the ground could be extinguished. Without lights on the ground to use as a navigation aid, German aviators would have a much harder time hitting their targets. If the blackout worked, it could save thousands of lives. And so by 1942, a vast array of blackout regulations had been published by the British government. These required that all windows and doors should be covered at night with suitable materials such as heavy curtains, cardboard, or paint, to prevent any glimmer of light being spotted by a German aircraft. External lights such as street lights were switched off or dimmed and shielded to deflect light downward. Essential lights such as traffic lights and vehicle headlights were fitted with slotted covers that would also deflect beams downwards to the ground. Blackouts proved one of the most unpopular aspects of the British war effort, given how disruptive they were for many civilian activities. This discontent was further exacerbated by the way in which blackouts were enforced. A civilian team of so-called air raid wardens were given carte blanche to hand out fines to those that broke the rules, and repeat offenders were even threatened with jail time. The sour relationship between the wardens and the general public caused a drop in morale at a time when it was needed the most, but nevertheless, the measures were effective at reducing casualties to German bombing raids. However, there were some serious downsides to the blackouts too. Light restrictions massively increased the risks of driving at night, and deaths in road accidents increased as a result. There were also reports that dock workers had fallen into the water and had drowned because their colleagues simply couldn't find them in time. And as an almost perpetual shroud of darkness fell over the British Isles every night, those that wished to use its cover emerged to prey on their communities. Police saw an increase of all kinds of theft, gang-related activities, indecent assault, and even serial murder. London in particular saw a sharp rise in nocturnal criminality during the era of the blackouts, one that didn't go unnoticed by a Royal Air Force crewman named Gordon Cummins. Gordon rented an apartment with his wife in the central London district of Southwark, a relatively older part of the city, settled into the south bank of the River Thames. He had dreams of being a fighter pilot, of taking to the skies and dogfighting with the German aces. But Gordon had other inclinations too. Despite being born in Yorkshire, Gordon spent his youth all over North Britain before eventually settling in London. And it was while he was living in the nation's capital that Gordon developed a rather bizarre desire. You see, despite his lower middle-class upbringing, Gordon fancied himself something of an aristocrat and developed a taste to match. He would often visit the more high-end hotel and clubs in the West End of London and spend outrageous amounts of money on champagne, mainly in an effort to impress those in attendance. Once he had their attention, Gordon would fabricate stories of being the illegitimate son of some wealthy old lord, one who was granted quite a healthy allowance too. He began to tweak his formerly rough Yorkshire accent into one of a well-spoken member of London high society, introducing himself as the Honorable Gordon Cummins to those he rubbed shoulders with. Yet in order to support this lifestyle, Gordon frequently engaged in acts of theft or embezzlement in order to finance his elaborate ruse. He told people he was soon to be a fighter pilot too, a hugely admired profession at the time. But this too was a falsehood. Gordon's entire life was a lie. And as the war rolled on, the darkness outside seemed to foster a darkness inside too. One that boiled up and spilled over into the spring of 1942, turning the dark streets of London into a pitch-black hunting ground. On the Sunday evening of February 8, 1942, Gordon Cummins had dinner with his wife, Marjorie, in their Southwark apartment. During dinner, he asked her if he could borrow £1 note since he wanted to have a night on the town. Marjorie obliged him, handing over the money to her serviceman husband and wishing him a good evening. To her, Gordon was a hero, serving his country in a time of war. She didn't mind that he wasn't home much or that he was distant when he was. He was busy, after all, helping fight the Germans. It's only natural that such a loving wife would lend her husband a few quid. And if she'd known what Gordon had planned for the next few days, if she could look inside of him and see the kind of evil that was about to blossom in his heart, she definitely wouldn't have been so eager. And yet she did. Gordon thanked his wife, leaving the apartment at around 6:30 that evening. Marjorie would have smiled and waved goodbye, completely unaware of the terror her husband intended to inflict. The next morning, a man named Harold Butcher was performing his daily checks of the local air raid shelters. He would ensure that they were in a fit state to withstand German bombing, and that there was no one left sleeping in them come morning, as they were often patronized by drunks and vagrants. But during a check of one particular shelter in Montague Place, he saw the shape of a woman lying on the ground. He tried to rouse her, but she didn't respond, and it was then that he noticed the scarf that was wrapped around her face and how her underwear had been pulled down below her knees. He kneeled down to take a hold of the woman's hand, only to find that it was cold. The woman was a pharmacist named Evelyn Hamilton, and she'd had the life strangled out of her on her 41st birthday. Her handbag was found nearby, but it had been completely emptied of belongings, presumably by the person that had killed her. Police had hoped to find the culprit's fingerprints on the bag, but found it was completely devoid of any forensic evidence. The only clue they had was the coroner's report that the killer was left-handed, and unless the killer struck again and provided more to go on, they would probably never be found. But as the saying goes, be careful what you wish for. You might just get it. Because on February 10th, the morning after Evelyn Hamilton's body was found, 2 electrical workers drove over to a house at 153 Wardour Street in Soho to perform some repairs. No one answered the door to the home, but given that the work was essential, the 2 electricians let themselves into the unlocked home and set out performing their tasks. For some reason, one of the workers found himself having to go into the master bedroom to check some wiring, but when he entered the room, he yelped in horror at the sight which greeted him. Lying on the bed was the lifeless corpse of 34-year-old Evelyn Oatley. There was blood around her mouth and nose from where she had been beaten mercilessly, all before her killer had cut her throat from ear to ear. Much like Evelyn Hamilton, this new victim had also been stripped, and on this occasion, the killer had taken their time to extensively mutilate her intimate area with a razor blade and tin opener. The crime scene was even more disturbing, but this time, the killer had left behind some forensic evidence. Fingerprints recovered from the blood-stained tin opener suggested the killer was left-handed, and strongly suggested that it was the exact same person that had killed Evelyn Hamilton in the Marylebone air raid shelter. The fingerprints didn't match any of the police records, but interviews with Oatley's friends and neighbors did yield some important clues. One eyewitness mentioned to investigators that night before, Oatley had been approached by a young mustachioed airman with chestnut brown hair outside a restaurant in Shaftesbury Avenue. A neighbor claimed to have seen Evelyn returning home at around 11:40 p.m., confirming she had been in the company of a strange man. The same neighbor said that sometime after midnight she heard the sound of Oatley's wireless radio being turned up much louder than usual, but chose not to complain to her about it. What's clear to us now is that this mysterious man had drowned out the sounds of Evelyn's terrified cries with the sounds of the radio, and that if her neighbor had only asked her to keep the volume down, she might have survived that night. But even as the police were busy investigating the left-handed killer's latest victim, he was busy planning a fresh hunt. For the 3rd morning in a row, some unfortunate Londoner stumbled upon the dead body of a murdered woman. This time it was a 43-year-old prostitute by the name of Margaret Lowe, strangled to death in her Marylebone apartment with her own silk stocking. But much like his previous victim, the left-handed killer had taken the time to ferociously mutilate his prey with a variety of household items. The forensic pathologist who performed her autopsy remarked that the wounds inflicted by her killer were quite dreadful, adding that the perpetrator was a savage maniac who indulged in a wicked lust to perpetrate the most diabolical injuries on the women he killed. He also confirmed that the extensive stab wounds to Margaret's right-hand side confirmed that the killer was left-handed. What's equally as disturbing is that a neighbor of Margaret Lowe's heard a man leaving her apartment in the wee small hours of the morning, one who whistled cheerfully to himself as he walked outside into Gosfield Street. Marylebone police were up to their eyeballs investigating the 3 murders of the previous week. They needed a solid break to catch their man, and as fortune would have it, one walked right into their station on February 12th. Catherine Mulliquet said she had been drinking with a handsome Royal Air Force man in a local pub and had agreed to take him back to her apartment. She later stated a strange smile appeared on the man's face as she removed her clothing, lay upon her bed, and beckoned him to join her. He removed his clothes, then approached Catherine in a manner that at first seemed affectionate, but to her shock and horror, he slammed his knees into her stomach and attempted to strangle her as he pinned her body to the bed with his own weight. Catherine fought her attacker, kicking him in the stomach and breaking free from his grasp. She then ran screaming from her flat to the house of a neighbor before rushing down to the police station to file a report. Catherine gave the police a detailed physical description of her attacker, something they had desperately needed. But Catherine came with another remarkable stroke of luck, one of her attacker's possessions. In his rush to escape, he had left an RAF webbing belt in her apartment, one that had an RAF regimental number stitched into it. Police contacted the Royal Air Force, inquiring as to which airman was assigned the number 525987. They discovered that number belonged to none other than Gordon Cummins. Detective Sergeant Thomas Shepard formally questioned Gordon on Valentine's morning of 1942. He admitted that he may well have attacked Catherine McCauley in a drunken haze, but was extremely apologetic, insisted he had attempted to properly compensate her. However, he completely denied murder and explained away the bruising on the knuckles of his left hand by claiming he had gotten his hand stuck in an aircraft engine while performing routine maintenance. Although they couldn't quite charge him with murder yet, the police could hold Cummins on charges of aggravated assault, which would buy them time to put together a proper case against him, and put a case against him they did. The case against Cummins was so airtight that a jury returned a guilty verdict after just 35 minutes. Each avoided making eye contact with Cummins as they filed back into the courtroom, who displayed no emotion as the verdict was read aloud. Gordon's wife, however, who also believed he was innocent, burst into ugly tears as her husband was pronounced guilty. When asked whether he had any legal reason or cause as to why the court should not impose the penalty of death, Cummins replied, "Because I am completely innocent, sir." But the judge was not convinced, and Cummins was then formally sentenced to death by hanging. Upon imposing this sentence, the judge stated, "Gordon Frederick Cummins, after a fair trial you have been found guilty, and on a charge of murder. As you know, there is only one sentence which the law permits me to pronounce, and that is you to be taken from this place to a lawful prison, and thence to a place of execution, and that you there will be hanged by the neck until you are dead. And may God have mercy on your soul." Gordon Cummins was executed by Albert Pierrepoint at Wandsworth Prison on June 25, 1942. Newspaper reports of the day indicate Cummins was given a glass of cognac to calm his nerves. He then walked stoically to the scaffold, flanked by 2 warders, without offering any assistance. The entire execution process lasted less than 2 minutes, and Gordon's execution became the only one in British history to have been performed during a German air raid. What's curious to note is that very few of Cummins' victims had any kind of defensive injuries when their body were found. Defensive injuries are those incurred when a person tried to defend themselves from an attacker, and if a murder victim lacks them, it can mean one of 2 things. Either the victim knew the person that killed them and had no reason to suspect danger, or the killer was able to take their victim completely by surprise. What's horrifyingly clear is that Gordon Cummins used Britain's wartime blackout restrictions to remain undetected while committing some of the vilest acts of murder since Jack the Ripper. Gordon even earned himself the nickname the Blackout Ripper, thanks to the similarities between his own crimes and that of Saucy Jack. Gordon had professed to so many that he enlisted in the RAF to protect his country, when in reality, his only interest was preying on those who were too vulnerable to defend themselves, people who'd been lucky enough to avoid German bombs, only to fall victim to a vicious, shameful predator. I remember the day Hurricane Ike struck Texas. It was a Friday night on September 12, 2008. I was 12 at the time, and my mom and dad were sitting in front of the TV watching as Ike crept closer towards our home in Houston. Before the winds got too intense, my dad drove over to Walmart to get some batteries, flashlights, and dry food. I'm alone with my mom, watching the weather report, and I remember getting really scared. The weather guy said the storm was 450 miles wide, and that was just about the biggest thing I'd ever heard of, so naturally I start thinking it's going to be the end of the world. Mom talks me down and tells me we'll be fine, but I'm not entirely convinced. By 6 p.m., the winds were about 40 miles an hour. It was pretty intense, but definitely not strong enough to do any serious damage to anything but tree branches. My dad comes back from Walmart, unloads the car, and then carries on watching the news with Mom. There was a call-in show on Channel 11 where people were asking a guy what kind of damage they could expect. And from what I remember, the guy was doing his very best to keep everyone calm while also trying to prepare people for what was obviously going to be a pretty wild storm. An hour or two later, the wind was howling at the back window. My dad used an old mattress to cover it up, then reinforced the mattress with the couch in his bedroom. Mom and Dad sent me to bed at around 10 that night, and I did actually try to fall asleep, but the wind was howling constantly, and gusts started to become a little more frequent, so there was no way I was getting any shut-eye. At around 11:30 p.m., the lights in the hallway outside my room started to flicker. I ran to the closet in my mom and dad's room and was quickly joined by my little sister, but we started to cry when my mom didn't want to get in. It wasn't so much she didn't want to get in the closet, she was just terrified and had no idea what to do. Me and my sister picked up on that pretty much straight away, and in no time we were terrified too. I remember we tried to calm her down, but another loud gust blew in and the garage downstairs started rumbling around 12:30 a.m. We lost power and the winds got louder, but not loud enough to drown out the sounds of me and my sister screaming when we thought we were about to get blown away. Being in the dark made everything infinitely scarier for obvious reasons, and I never heard wind make noises like that before. It sounded like a train 1 minute and a wolf howling the next. The winds were probably between 70 or 80 by that time. Water was falling from the roof like Niagara Falls. The giant pine trees were bending at 45-degree angles with branches snapping off. Mom closed the door and finally took refuge in the closet. She was crying at one point, and that time it was our turn to tell her everything was going to be okay. At 1:30 a.m., the black window shattered and glass and rain started to come in. I flashed a light to help Dad see while he grabbed some trash bags to cover the TV and computer in his room. I heard debris hitting the building and the wind was deafening. The winds were above 75 miles per hour around that time. All night the wind was screaming. We spent 10 to 12 hours in the closet until noon Saturday. It was a mess outside. Shingles littered the floor and tree branches and twigs were everywhere. My dad's old pair of shoes were still next to the door, and the yard was even worse. Pine trees were snapped in half and entire trees were down on the ground. We were both scared out of our wits and I cried, but Mom reassured me that we made it and we were okay. By Sunday afternoon, the power was restored and we started to learn about the true devastation Ike did to the state. I was thankful we didn't lose our home or lives for that matter. Some areas along the coast were wrecked or wiped out from the storm surge. Watching the wreckage, it ran a chill down my spine, but it showed me the true power of these cyclones. I know it's not much of a typical scary story, but tropical cyclones are nothing to mess with. It's a story I'll tell my kids one day. Hey friends, thanks for listening. Click that notification bell to be alerted of all future narrations. If you got a story, be sure to submit them to my subreddit, r/Let'sReadOfficial, and give and receive feedback from the community, and maybe even hear your story featured on the next video. And join a live stream to catch an invite to my Discord. And if you want to support me even more, grab early access to all future narrations for just $1 a month on Patreon, and maybe even pick up some Let's Read merch on Spreadshirt. And check out the Let's Read podcast, where you can hear all these stories in long compilation form and save huge on data, located anywhere you listen to podcasts. Links down in the description. Thanks so much, friends. And remember, don't overcook bananas.